Now that you know a little bit more about what types of information sensors can gather, well, once a sensor's gathered it, what do you do with that information? Well, those signals are converted into generally one of two categories. Either they're analog, which means that there is an infinite set of possibilities within a specified range. If you were to graph it, it might look something like this. So let's take temperature, for example. Temperature can be so specific, you can break it down, and it can be varied so much that really there's an infinite amount of different temperatures it could be outside. Then there's digital signals. Digital signals have a limited set of values, meaning a countable set of values that something can be. If you were to graph it, it might look something more like this. You can think of digital things like how many times was the button pressed? That is a discrete number of times because the button is pressed on or it's not. And you can count those things in an int value. So now you've got your sensors, you're probably thinking, hey, pretty much everything in the world is analog. And you're right, we live in an analog world. So our sensors are collecting data in that way. However, there's a few different ways for you to convert it into the way the computer understands. It is important to note that the Raspberry Pi 3 only reads digital signals. So no matter what you're reading, you gotta transform it into something it can understand. Now, there are digital sensors, like the RGB sensor in your box. Digital sensors don't mean that they collect digital information necessarily. They can collect analog information, but they probably already have a program within them to take that analog and bucket it into discrete values. So instead of having an infinite number of possibilities, it just has a lot of slightly different possibilities so that it's still understandable to a computer, but the precision is something that still makes sense to humans. There's also analog sensors, like the photocell in your box. Now, these don't do anything with the information they gather from the real world. It's still just analog. However, the Raspberry Pi can't understand that. But that's okay, because there's a separate chip in your box called the analog to digital converter that if you pass the information from your analog sensor through that chip before you pass it to the Raspberry Pi, it'll do that digital bucketing for you. In our projects, we're going to help you learn how to work with all of these different types of sensors and make sure that you're converting your data appropriately. But it's ultimately an analog world, and we have to understand how computers work to make sure that we're collecting data that makes sense for us and then giving it to the computer in a way that it can actually do something with it.